Shaq was enjoying a peaceful afternoon when suddenly a cop's fist slammed into an elderly black woman's face, sending her crashing to the pavement. Gasps filled the air. Cars screeched to a halt. Phones shot up, recording every brutal second. The officer smirked, thinking he'd get away with it. But what he didn't know, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Shaq didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just smiled, because he had a plan. And what he did next, it didn't just end the cop's career, it left the entire world speechless. Stay till the end, because this story will take a turn you never saw coming. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Shaq stepped out of the grocery store, adjusting the bag of groceries in his massive hands, inhaling the fresh evening air. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the parking lot. People moved about, some heading to their cars, others waiting by the bus stop. Just another ordinary day, until a loud thud shattered the calm. Shaq's head snapped in the direction of the noise, his sharp eyes locking onto the source. Across the lot near the bus stop, an elderly black woman had hit the pavement. Ms. Jenkins, a frail woman in her 70s, lay sprawled on the concrete, her purse clutched tightly against her chest. A uniformed cop loomed over her, his heavy chest heaving with barely contained rage. Officer Riley, a burly, broad-shouldered white man with a buzz cut, his face was twisted in irritation. His fingers flexed at his sides as if daring her to get back up. "I told you to move, lady," he barked, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Ms. Jenkins struggled to push herself up, her wrinkled hands trembling. "I ain't done nothing wrong," she gasped, her voice weak but defiant. Riley sneered. "Yeah, well, you ain't listening." Then, without hesitation, without an ounce of restraint, he pulled back his fist. The collective gasp from the onlookers seemed to slow time. Shaq's body tensed as he saw it coming, but before he could move, crack! The officer's knuckles collided with Miss Jenkins' face, snapping her head to the side. She crumpled to the pavement like a rag doll, her hat tumbling away, revealing short, silver-streaked hair. For a moment there was nothing, no noise, no movement. The world stood still. Then, chaos. People screamed. A woman dropped her shopping bags. A car came to a screeching halt as the driver gawked at the scene. Phones were already out, recording. Shaq's grip tightened around his grocery bag, his knuckles turning white. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his neck tensing. His entire body pulsed with fury, but his mind remained razor-sharp. Riley exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders as if this was just another day on the job. He glanced at the forming crowd, his lips curling into a smirk. "Ain't nobody gonna do nothing," he muttered. Wrong move. Shaq let his bag drop to the ground with a soft thud. He stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the pavement. Riley turned just as Shaq's voice cut through the air, deep and unshaken. "Oh, you done messed up now." Riley's cocky smirk faded as Shaq marched toward him, fists clenched, eyes locked, and the crowd whispering in anticipation. Riley smirked, rolling his shoulders as he surveyed the growing crowd. Phones were out, recording, but he wasn't worried. He'd been in situations like this before. Civilians too scared to do anything but watch. "Ain't nobody gonna do nothing," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if this was just another routine stop. Then the light around him shifted. A looming shadow stretched across the pavement, swallowing him whole. Something in the air changed. Riley turned, and his smirk evaporated. Shaquille O'Neal towered over him, his massive frame as solid as a brick wall. His deep brown eyes locked onto the officer with an intensity that sent a cold shiver down Riley's spine. The air between them grew thick, charged like a storm seconds before the first crack of thunder. Shaq's voice was steady, low, and full of restrained fury. "You proud of yourself, tough guy?" Riley straightened his shoulders, trying to mask the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Step back," he ordered, his fingers twitching near his belt. "Or you're next." Shaq let out a slow, dark chuckle. It was the kind of laugh that didn't come from amusement, but from knowing something the other person didn't. "Oh, you really don't know who I am." The officer's jaw clenched, his fingers inching closer to his taser. Miss Jenkins let out a pained groan from the pavement, shifting slightly, her face contorted in pain. The sound should have snapped Riley out of his aggression, but instead he barely spared her a glance. His focus remained on Shaq, sizing him up, trying to figure out if this was a fight he could win. The murmuring from the crowd grew louder. People were just watching now. They were waiting. For the first time, Riley hesitated. Then, he made the worst mistake of his life. His hand shot to his taser, fingers wrapping around the grip as he yanked it from his belt. But before he could pull it up, before he could even think about squeezing the trigger, Shaq moved. His massive hand shot out with lightning speed, clamping around Riley's wrist like an iron vise. The officer froze. He tried to yank his arm back, but it didn't budge. His eyes darted up wide now, panic flickering in them. Shaq's grip tightened, his voice dropping lower. "You don't want to do that." Riley swallowed hard, realizing, too late, he had just messed with the wrong man. The sound of screeching tires cut through the tense air as a second police car sped onto the scene. The flashing red and blue lights painted the pavement in rapid pulses, reflecting in the wide eyes of the gathered crowd. Riley's lips curled into a smug grin. "That's my boys," he muttered under his breath, straightening his shoulders. "You're done now." Shaq didn't move. He simply watched, arms still crossed over his massive chest, his face unreadable. The car door swung open, and out stepped Officer Blake, a lean, clean-cut cop with a hardened look in his eyes. He scanned the scene, instantly taking in the furious crowd, the trembling elderly woman on the pavement, and, most concerning, the unmistakable figure of Shaquille O'Neal towering over Riley. His brows furrowed as he slammed the door shut. "Riley, what the hell's going on?" Before Riley could speak, the crowd erupted. "He punched an old lady," someone shouted. "Broke her damn nose for nothing," another voice added. Blake's head snapped toward Miss Jenkins, who was now sitting up, clutching her face with a blood-stained tissue. A small, pained moan left her lips as she tried to push herself up. Blake's face drained of color. He took a slow step forward, his hands resting on his belt. "Riley, tell me they're lying." Riley scoffed, shaking his head. "Come on, man, you know how these people get." "She was resisting. I had to control the situation." Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose, a dark, humorless chuckle escaping his lips. "You had to hit a grandma?" His deep voice carried across the parking lot like a warning bell. Blake swallowed hard. His gaze flicked to the multiple phones recording, the expectant looks on every bystander's face. For the first time, Riley's backup didn't seem so sure about backing him up. Shaq tilted his head. "So," he let the word hang in the air. "What y'all gonna do now?" Blake turned back to Riley, his expression unreadable. His jaw tightened. "Did you seriously hit her?" Riley's smirk faltered. For the first time, he realized he was on his own. The atmosphere in the parking lot had shifted completely. What had begun as a routine confrontation had spiraled into something much larger, something raw and unfiltered. The energy crackled in the air, thick with outrage, disbelief, and a growing thirst for justice. People were no longer just passive bystanders. They were witnesses, voices in a collective reckoning. A woman near the front of the crowd stepped forward, her face twisted in fury, her phone still raised. "He needs to be arrested," she shouted, her voice sharp and unwavering. Others echoed her anger, their voices overlapping in a chaotic swell of demands. "If that was one of us who hit her, we'd be in handcuffs already," a man called out, shaking his head in disgust. The grip Officer Riley had on the situation was slipping, and fast. His confident stance faltered, his hands twitching at his sides as his eyes darted from one phone screen to the next. The sweat glistening on his forehead was no longer just from the afternoon sun. It was panic, creeping up his spine, tightening its grip around his throat. "This ain't what it looks like," he barked suddenly, his voice louder than necessary, as if sheer volume could drown out the damning reality surrounding him. His eyes locked onto Officer Blake, searching desperately for some form of backup, some validation, but Blake's expression remained unreadable. Shaq, who had been standing still, an unmoving force of quiet fury, took a single step forward. His sheer size cast a looming shadow over Riley, forcing the officer to tilt his head slightly just to meet his eyes. "Oh, it's exactly what it looks like," Shaq said, his voice low and deliberate. There was no shouting, no bravado, just an unshakable certainty that made his words feel heavier, like a judge delivering a final verdict. Ms. Jenkins, still on the pavement, let out a shaky breath, her frail hands pressing into the ground as she tried to lift herself up. The struggle in her movements was painful to watch. Even as Shaq bent down to help her, the elderly woman's hands trembled as she reached for his arm, her fingers barely gripping his forearm. "You okay, ma'am?" Shaq asked, his voice softening just slightly, though the tension in his body hadn't eased. Miss Jenkins winced, her lips swollen, a thin trickle of blood running down her chin. Her breath was shaky, but her voice, though weak, carried the weight of 1,000 injustices. "He hit me," she said, her words fragmented by the pain she was barely holding back. For no reason, a ripple of fury surged through the crowd. The anger, once a scattered flame, now burned like wildfire. People who had been watching silently suddenly found their voices, shouting over each other, their outrage swelling into a wave of righteous fury. Blake let out a sharp exhale, his fingers hesitating over his radio. He closed his eyes for half a second, as if making a difficult decision. Then his hand moved with finality, gripping the radio attached to his shoulder. "I gotta call this in," he muttered, his voice grim, already knowing the consequences of what he was about to do. Riley's entire body snapped toward him, his face contorted with desperation. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the intensity behind it was unmistakable. "Don't!" he hissed, his entire career flashing before his eyes. But it was too late. Shaq let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head as he watched the scene unfold. His arms folded across his chest, his expression unreadable, though the knowing glint in his eyes said everything that needed to be said. He wasn't surprised. He had seen men like Riley before, men who thought their badge was a shield against accountability, men who had never truly faced the weight of their own actions. "Oh," Shaq said, his voice rich with something between amusement and finality. "It's way too late for that." The wail of approaching sirens cut through the chaos. Riley's face drained of all color as he realized his time was up. Riley's smug grin hadn't completely faded, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as he watched Shaq pull out his phone. The cop had been in plenty of tense situations before, but none quite like this. The crowd was growing, the cameras were rolling, and for the first time, Riley wasn't the one in control. "Go ahead," Riley scoffed, shifting his weight as if he was still trying to intimidate Shaq. "Call your lawyer. Ain't gonna change a damn thing." His fingers twitched near his belt, but even he knew reaching for anything right now would be a mistake. Shaq didn't even acknowledge Riley's words. His fingers moved smoothly over his screen, his expression unreadable. Then a grin crept onto his face, slow and deliberate. "Nah, man," Shaq said, shaking his head slightly. "I'm calling the police chief." Riley's entire demeanor shifted. His smirk faltered, his lips parting as if he had misheard. His eyes darted toward Officer Blake, who was still gripping his radio, waiting for a response from dispatch. "Wait, what?" Riley said, his voice lacking the confidence it held just seconds ago. Shaq brought the phone to his ear, tilting his head slightly as the line rang. The tension was thick, suffocating. Even the murmurs from the crowd had died down as people strained to listen. Riley swallowed hard. He knew the name, Chief Reynolds, a man who didn't tolerate bad cops, a man who had no patience for officers who made the department look bad, a man who, if he found out what just happened, wouldn't hesitate to make an example out of someone. Shaq's face remained impassive as the ringing continued. Then finally a deep, authoritative voice answered on the other end. "Yo, Chief Reynolds," Shaq said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He glanced at Riley, his grin widening as he locked eyes with the now visibly sweating officer. "We got a problem." Riley's face drained of color. He had just made the worst mistake of his career. Riley's confidence evaporated the moment Shaq spoke those words. His pulse thundered in his ears as he watched Shaq hold the phone to his ear, speaking casually, too casually. "Yeah, Chief, we got a real situation here," Shaq continued, his deep voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "One of your officers just punched an elderly woman, and before you ask, yeah, it's all on camera." Riley swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. His gaze darted toward Officer Blake, hoping for some backup, but Blake only took a slow step away from him. "Dude," Blake whispered under his breath, his eyes dark with disbelief. "You hit a grandma." On camera, Riley's skin burned under the weight of the crowd's judgment. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now felt suffocating. The murmurs grew louder, anger brewing in every voice. Then, sirens. The distant wail of approaching police vehicles sent a cold spike of panic through Riley's chest. He had called for backup earlier, expecting his fellow officers to come and clean up his mess, to handle Shaq, to silence the crowd. But as the sound grew louder, as more patrol cars arrived, something felt off. The officers stepping out weren't rushing to his defense. Instead, they hesitated, scanning the scene, confusion written all over their faces. Their eyes flicked between Riley, the still recovering Ms. Jenkins, and the growing number of cell phones capturing every second. Then came the final blow. A sleek, black SUV rolled up, cutting through the sea of police cruisers like a shark among minnows. The tinted windows hid whoever was inside, but Riley already knew. His knees felt weak. The door swung open with force. Out stepped Chief Reynolds. The man was built like a tank, his broad shoulders squared, his crisp uniform practically radiating authority. His sharp eyes locked onto Riley immediately. No words, no hesitation, just pure, seething fury in his stare. Riley tried to straighten his posture, to regain some control of the situation, but it was too late. Reynolds took one slow step forward, then another. Finally, his voice came, cold and sharp as steel. "You!" Riley's stomach dropped. He knew. His career was over. Riley felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a collapsing building. The usual authority he wielded with ease, the power of his uniform, his badge, his rank, meant nothing now. Not when Chief Reynolds was here. Not when the whole world was watching. Reynolds stood motionless as he held up a phone, watching the damning footage unfold in crisp detail. The video was crystal clear. Riley's fist connecting with Miss Jenkins's frail face, the sickening thud of her body hitting the pavement, the gasps, the horror, the sheer brutality of it all. The entire parking lot was silent, save for the muffled audio of the recording. Then the chief's expression changed. His jaw tightened. His eyes, already sharp, burned with a controlled rage. He clenched the phone in his hands so tightly that for a second, it looked like it might shatter. Then he exhaled, slow and deliberate, before shifting his gaze to Riley. "You're done." The words weren't shouted. They weren't barked like an order. They were low, steady, and final. A death sentence in just 2 syllables. Riley took an instinctive step back. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then, panic. But Chief, she wasn't listening. She was being aggressive." Riley stammered, his voice cracking, his usual confidence shattered. "I told her to move." Reynolds didn't blink. "And so you decided to punch her?" Riley's lips trembled. She... Shut up." Reynolds cut him off like a guillotine dropping. The weight of those words crushed whatever excuse Riley had left. A murmur rippled through the watching officers. They'd never seen the chief like this. So cold, so furious, so absolutely done with someone's nonsense. Reynolds turned to Shaq, the tension momentarily easing. "I appreciate you stepping in. If you hadn't been here, God knows how much worse this could have gotten." Shaq tilted his head slightly, cracking his knuckles. "Oh, I ain't done yet." Riley's stomach twisted. What else could Shaq possibly have planned? Shaq crouched down beside Miss Jenkins, his massive frame shielding her from the chaos still unfolding around them. Her frail hands trembled as she clutched her bruised cheek. Her lips split from the brutal punch Riley had delivered. The once fiery defiance in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. "You okay, ma'am?" Shaq asked, his voice gentle, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. Ms. Jenkins exhaled shakily, her body still reeling from the impact. "I'll be all right, son," she murmured, wincing as she tried to sit up. Just want him to pay for what he did." Shaq's jaw clenched. That was all he needed to hear. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Chief Reynolds with an intensity that made the air feel thick. The message in his eyes was clear. This cannot be swept under the rug. "So," Shaq said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What's happening to him?" The weight of his question sent a ripple of unease through the gathered officers. Even Riley, despite his arrogance, stood frozen, his once cocky demeanor replaced by sheer panic. Reynolds, still watching Shaq, took a long breath before speaking. "He's getting what he deserves." Riley's breath hitched. For the first time, real fear flashed across his face. Officer Riley had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable. But now, for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. The parking lot was dead silent except for the sound of handcuffs clicking shut around his thick wrists. Officer Blake, his own partner, was the one securing them. "You're under arrest for assault," Blake said, his voice tight with restrained anger. He yanked Riley's hands behind his back with a rough jerk. The moment those words were spoken, the crowd erupted. Cheers, claps, and shouts of approval filled the air, echoing across the lot. Some bystanders even whistled and chanted, a rare moment of justice being served in real time. Shaq stood towering over Riley, watching him with an expression that was neither smug nor gloating, just cold, unwavering judgment. He stepped in close, lowering his voice so only Riley could hear. "Guess what, tough guy?" Shaq rumbled. "The cameras don't lie." Riley's face burned red, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He looked around wildly, searching for some kind of escape, some way to twist the situation. But there was nothing. No department cover-up, no corrupt superior swooping in to save him. The same system he had abused was now turning against him. "You can't do this," Riley finally snapped, struggling against the cuffs. "I was doing my job." "Your job," Chief Reynolds scoffed, stepping forward, arms crossed. "Your job was to protect, not attack innocent people. You disgraced this badge." Ms. Jenkins, still being helped up by medics, lifted her head slightly, watching. Despite the pain, a small, tired smile touched her lips. Blake and another officer began leading Riley toward the squad car. But Riley, desperate, tried one last thing. "You need me," he shouted. "I've served this city for 15 years. I'm not the bad guy." Shaq just shook his head. "No, Riley, you're not the bad guy," he smirked. "You're just another coward who thought he'd never get caught." As the officers shoved him toward the squad car, Riley let out a scream of rage. He thrashed, kicking at the pavement. But the officers pushed him forward, forcing him into the back seat. The door slammed shut, locking Riley inside. The same cage he once threw others into. Now his own prison. Within hours, the parking lot incident had spread like wildfire across social media. Justice for Ms. Jenkins trended at the top of Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. The video of Riley punching an elderly woman, then getting arrested himself, racked up millions of views overnight. News outlets picked it up, playing the clip on repeat. The public was outraged. One clip, taken from a close angle, captured everything in perfect detail. Ms. Jenkins's frail body crumpling to the pavement, the raw shock on bystanders' faces, and Shaq stepping in like a force of nature. It cut right to the moment Riley was shoved into the squad car, his face red with humiliation and fury. Comments flooded in. "He deserves everything coming to him. Shaq is a real one for stepping in like that. An old woman? That man should never have been a cop in the first place." The backlash wasn't just online. TV stations picked up the story. News anchors discussed police brutality, accountability, and the power of bystander footage. Civil rights activists called for swift justice, while community leaders demanded reforms. Then the situation escalated. The mayor herself issued a statement. "The actions of Officer Riley are inexcusable. A full investigation has been launched into this case, and justice will be served." That was the final blow. The very next morning, a press conference was held outside the police department. Reporters swarmed the building, cameras flashing. Chief Reynolds stepped up to the podium, grim-faced. "Effective immediately, Officer Riley has been terminated from the force. His actions do not reflect the values of this department or the city we serve." The words echoed across news stations and social media alike. Riley was done. As Riley watched the press conference from a jail cell, his face twisted in horror. His worst fear had come true. His badge was gone, and there was no coming back. Riley sat in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of his laptop screen casting harsh shadows on his unshaven face. His eyes scanned the email for the third time, hoping he had misread it, but the words remained unchanged. "Dear Mr. Riley, after reviewing your application, we regret to inform you that we will not be moving forward. We require officers with integrity and professionalism, qualities that, given your public record, do not align with our department's standards." He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples as the weight of his reality pressed down on him. 6 different police departments, 6 rejections. The moment his mugshot had appeared on the news, his career was finished. No law enforcement agency wanted to be associated with a disgraced cop whose actions had sparked nationwide outrage. At first, he told himself it was temporary, that things would blow over, that someone, somewhere, would give him a second chance. But as weeks passed, the reality became clearer. No precinct wanted him. No private security firm would take the risk. Even jobs outside law enforcement turned him down the moment they ran a background check. With no savings and bills piling up, he had no choice but to accept the only position he could find, a low-paying job as a grocery store security guard. Every night, he stood stiffly by the entrance, dressed in a cheap uniform that barely fit, scanning customers as they walked in and out. Gone was the authority he once abused. Now, instead of making arrests, he was reduced to checking receipts and preventing teenagers from pocketing candy bars. The irony was unbearable. And then came the moment he dreaded most. 1 month after his downfall, Shaquille O'Neal walked into the store. The towering athlete strolled through the entrance, effortlessly drawing attention with his massive frame. At first, Riley prayed Shaq wouldn't notice him. He turned slightly, lowering the brim of his cap, hoping to blend into the background. But it was no use. Shaq's sharp eyes locked onto him almost immediately. For a long, agonizing moment, Riley stood frozen. A surge of emotions twisted inside him. Anger, humiliation, resentment. The man who had single-handedly destroyed his life was now standing just a few feet away, looking at him not with hatred, but with something far worse, pity. Shaq casually grabbed a bag of chips and walked toward the register, his presence commanding the room as he passed. Riley clenched his fists, his jaw tightening, but he knew deep down there was nothing left to fight for. And Shaq? He wasn't about to walk away without saying something. The fluorescent lights hummed softly as Shaq strolled through the grocery store aisles, effortlessly towering over the shelves. He moved at an easy pace, grabbing a bottle of water and a protein bar, completely unbothered, until he saw the familiar, slumped figure near the exit. Riley. The former cop stood by the security post, his cheap polyester uniform wrinkled, his once cocky posture replaced by hunched shoulders and tired eyes. He had aged in just a few weeks. His face looked hollow, his movements mechanical, a man stripped of power, left with nothing but regret. For a moment, Shaq simply observed. There was no anger left in him, no grudge to hold, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing karma had done its job. He made his way toward the checkout counter, casually placing his items on the conveyor belt. He could feel Riley's gaze flicker toward him, then quickly dart away. The once feared officer, the same man who had punched an elderly woman without hesitation, now couldn't even look Shaq in the eye. Shaq smirked. "Funny seeing you here." Riley swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the podium as if bracing himself. His voice came out hoarse. "Just take your stuff, man." The cashier finished scanning Shaq's items. As he reached for his wallet, he paused, glancing back at Riley. There was no point in rubbing salt in the wound. Life had already done that. Instead, he pulled out a crisp $100 bill, placed it on the counter, and turned toward the exit. He didn't say anything more, because he didn't have to. As he walked away, Riley stood frozen, his eyes locked on the bill, his face a mixture of shame, anger, and the bitter taste of defeat. Shaq disappeared through the doors, leaving behind a simple but powerful message. Sometimes the worst punishment isn't revenge. It's letting a man live with what he's done,